The moment my ex looked the judge straight in the eye and said, "She's unstable. She's lying to our daughter. I want full custody," I felt the air leave my lungs, as if someone had imperceptibly lifted the lid from the vessel that was always bubbling in my chest and released not only my breath, but also the last remnants of faith in justice, in reason, in human compassion, which, as I naively thought, could still be found. Even in the cold, verified to the last decimal point system, which is called the court. He said it so calmly, as if he were stating a fact, as if it wasn't about ruining my life or ripping Aurora out of my arms, but about the weather or buying a new sofa, and the judge, a woman with an expression that was hard to read, seemed to really believe him, or maybe just she pretended to believe, because it was easier than delving into the complex truth outside of neat case files. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. I wanted to speak out, I wanted to scream, cry, explain something, but nothing came out. My throat constricted, as if my vocal cords were covered with ice, and my heart was beating somewhere in my stomach, cold, pounding in the wrong place. I sat there on a hard wooden chair, feeling pain freeze in every curve of my back, while the man who had told me not so long ago that he loved me portrayed me in front of the judge as a danger, as a threat to the only person I really loved and for whom I lived, for my daughter, my sense, my little Aurora. She was sitting behind me, with an expression of seriousness unacceptable for a 7-year-old child, holding my mother's hand, not squeezing, but as if clinging, like a drowning man clinging to a piece of wood in cold water. She saw everything. She saw how my hands were clenching, how my shoulders were shaking, how I couldn't say a word, and in her big brown eyes, just like mine, there was a pain that shouldn't have been familiar to a child her age. And then I realized that she wasn't just present, she was feeling. I was drowning, and no one threw me a rope, no one tried to save me, not a lawyer, not a judge, not even myself. Thomas, my ex-husband, was dressed in a dark blue suit with a silk tie and shoes polished to a mirror shine, as if he had not come to court, but to an interview with a multinational corporation, and sat straight, perfectly folded his arms, radiating confidence, calmness and, as always, deceptive charm. He was charming, he always was, and that was the trouble. The ability to control perception, bend reality to suit himself, force others to see what was beneficial to him and ignore what really was. When the judge finally asked if I wanted to say something, I felt like something inside me had completely broken down, and even though I opened my mouth, all that came out of me was a ragged breath, as if I was trying to breathe an air that no longer existed. My lawyer, who was silent and seemed to have already mentally signed his defeat, just looked at me, not encouraging or condemning, he just waited. There was silence in the hall, so thick and heavy that it seemed like every glance, every breath left a mark on it, and I knew this was the moment when everything could change, but I was paralyzed. And then, as if in slow motion, I heard a voice, a child's voice, but firm, clear, and unquestionable. "Your Honor, I brought the video from Dad's phone. I think you should see this." At first it seemed to me that this was an illusion, a hallucination caused by stress, but the courtroom froze. Heads turned, and I saw my daughter getting up from her seat, holding her pink tablet with shiny stickers in a slightly peeled corner, as if it were not just a gadget, but proof, an artifact capable of turning the tide. The course of events. The judge frowned, Thomas's face paled, and for the first time in the entire hearing, she, Judge Fabry, a woman with a steely voice and perfect posture, looked genuinely surprised. Aurora walked down the aisle, not hurrying, confidently, not letting go of the tablet from her hands, not taking her eyes off the judge, not even allowing me to give a sign or interfere. She walked past the wooden benches, past the man who was trying to lead her away from me, and handed the judge her tablet, with the expression on her face that I had seen on her only once, when she fell off her bike, refused to cry and only pressed her lips tighter, looking at me through tears, holding them back as if she already knew then that tears don't always help. I didn't even know she had it with her. I didn't notice how she hid it. I didn't realize she was writing something down. I didn't realize she could record on Thomas's phone, and most importantly, I couldn't believe that my 7-year-old daughter would take the step I did. An adult woman, I didn't dare for months, a step towards the truth, towards the light that I was afraid to light myself. But I knew that something had changed not only in the courtroom, not only in this cold room with high ceilings and the smell of paper, but in the very fabric of what was happening, in how the day was shaping up, how time was moving, how the sky was falling on my shoulders. The judge took the tablet away, holding it with both hands, as something weighty, as proof capable of turning the idea of reality around. "What's it? What is it?" she asked, and for the first time her voice, usually stern and dry, sounded with a hint of surprise and even, as it seemed to me, alarm. Aurora's voice was quiet but confident. She did not mumble, did not hide, did not doubt, but said it as if she had rehearsed it in advance. "Since last weekend, Dad has been telling me these things when I should have been sleeping, but I haven't been sleeping. I heard him, and he was very angry. And I thought, if you didn't believe Mom, maybe you would have believed him." My heart burst. It didn't just shrink, it seemed to crumble into thousands of tiny pieces, and each of them stabbed from the inside, causing pain, and at the same time bringing relief, because it was at that moment that I realized that I was no longer alone, that the truth was no longer hidden under the pillow, under the carpet, in a password-protected folder. My daughter did what I couldn't. She stood up, told the truth, told it to everyone, and suddenly the courtroom, the place where I felt like the smallest, most helpless, weakest being, became hers, Aurora, my girl with a heart bigger than this world. Before the courtroom, before the lawsuit, before the silence and the cold eyes of the judge, before the video, it was just us, me and Aurora, the two of us in our small apartment with 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom and creaking floors that made noises as soon as I tried to walk across them after 10 at night, but Aurora didn't care. She liked it. She called our house a nest. She said that the pink curtains in her room made her bedroom look like the inside of a cloud of cotton candy, and then, at such moments, it seemed to me that I was coping, that even in conditions of eternal lack of time, with money and peace of mind, we create something real, something warm and reliable. Most nights she would lie on the bed with a stuffed penguin, which she called Pepper, and ask me to read her 2 stories instead of 1, and I would always say yes, even if my eyes were heavy with fatigue, because I knew that every such night was stored in my memory like a jewel that could not be lost. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, and the orders that came to me irregularly brought just enough so that we could stay afloat, not luxuriously, but with dignity, not with excess, but with love. My mom, Eleanor, lived a few blocks away, and even though she sometimes said things that hurt, she was the one who always came to the rescue. She brought lasagna without warning, washed the tub while I was distracted at work, and hugged me with words, "You're doing better than you think, Gabriella," and I trusted her, even if only for a little while. Aurora was 7 years old, but she was already smart, kind-hearted, and frighteningly observant. Her questions, often simple and direct, baffled adults, forcing them to be more honest than they were used to. One day she found me in the kitchen, late at night, when I was hunched over the table, crying silently in my palm, and she didn't say anything, just brought her blanket, threw it over my shoulders and stayed by my side until I stopped shaking. And most of all, we liked the jar of truth, an ordinary glass jar in which she put her notes, written in a clumsy childish handwriting, with questions and thoughts that she did not dare to say out loud. Every night we read one together, and although some of them were stupid, like "Why do people snore?" others made me freeze. "Will Dad stop loving me if I stay with you?" And I answered honestly, even if I wanted to howl from the pain. The divorce from Thomas wasn't clean. He didn't want to be a father so much as he wanted to control me, my life, my decisions, my daughter. On paper, it's joint custody, but in reality it's constant monitoring, accusations, doubts, ridicule. He criticized my food, my daily routine, my parenting methods. He complained if I stayed for a couple of minutes, and on her weekends Aurora returned withdrawn, silent, sometimes not talking at all until Tuesday. I tried to talk about it. I tried to show how he was pushing me, but he knew how to pretend. A former athlete, now a sales manager, one of those who remembers names, tells jokes, makes an impression that no one notices the truth behind. And behind the smile, outbursts of anger, accusations, cruel words. I collected everything, emails, messages, screenshots. But I didn't show them to Aurora. I thought I was protecting her. One night, after a particularly stressful break, when Aurora returned from Thomas's, silent, with hunched shoulders and a tired look, as if the worries of the adult world had fallen on her small shoulders, which she could not express in words, she suddenly, sitting at the table with a cup of cereal, asked if I had ever been afraid next to Dad, and even though the question came out unexpectedly, my heart immediately sank, because it wasn't childish curiosity, but some kind of adult recognition. as if she already knew the answer, but needed my confession to stop feeling guilty. I paused, put down my spoon, not because the food had lost its taste, but because the very thought of the past instantly overshadowed the present, and before I could say anything, she looked down at her plate and quietly added, "Yes, but I don't think I should say that." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock tick off the seconds, and wondering if I'd let her down with my silence, if I'd betrayed her by trying to keep the world where it hadn't been for a long time, if I was trying to please and protect her at the same time. A task that was doomed to failure from the very beginning. A few weeks later, Thomas applied for full custody, and when I read the first lines, where he claimed that I was causing emotional harm to Aurora, that I was lying to her about him and was unable to provide a stable environment, my hands began to tremble, and I sank to the floor because my legs could no longer support me, because the weight the accusations, expressed in dry legal words, seemed almost physical, oppressive, like a concrete slab. Eleanor, my mother, sat down next to me, took my wrist, squeezed it as best she could, and whispered, "You know the truth. That's enough." And although I wanted to believe her, I knew that the truth rarely sounds loud in court. It hides between the lines, breaks down into phrases, is taken out of context and is presented as weakness. Thomas's lawyer, a man with predatory eyes and a velvety voice, painted before the court the image of a woman who had lost control, an extremely subjective but carefully prepared portrait of me, Gabriella, with hints of imbalance, emotional instability, and weakness, which allegedly prevents me from being a good mother. My lawyer, who is careful and always focused, asked me to hold on, not to show emotions, not to speak uninvited and in no case to interrupt, because, in his opinion, female restraint always looks more advantageous than rage, even if rage is fair. But inside I was screaming, everything was burning inside me, every word that I couldn't utter was burning from the inside out. Aurora saw it all. I tried to hide every tear, I muffled every convulsive breathing with a pillow, every night I whispered, "Everything will be fine," even when I doubted it myself. I didn't know that she was watching so intently, I didn't know that she was hearing more than I thought, I didn't know that a plan was already forming in her head. She was only 7 years old, but somehow she understood something that none of us had said, not even me, even in those moments when I wanted to snap. She knew that the truth mattered, and that sometimes, in order for it to sound, you need to take a step that adults don't dare to take. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, and I barely slept that night. Aurora fell asleep with a penguin under her arm. Her breathing was steady, calm, and I sat by her bed, holding her hand, looking at a face in which the features of Thomas and me were mixed, and thought how I should fight for a future, for a life where she will be free, loved and heard. In the morning, Mom came with us, wearing her church scarf, which she hadn't worn since Dad died, and I realized that she put it on to remind herself of the power that we pass on from generation to generation. Aurora chose a blue dress with sunflowers, her favorite, and put her school tablet in her backpack. I didn't think much of it, deciding that she just didn't want to keep up with the schedule, that she needed the tablet for lessons. She hardly spoke in the car, just stared out the window, humming an unfamiliar melody, and there was something disturbing and calm at the same time in this melody, as if she knew more than she was saying. When we entered the courthouse, Thomas was already waiting, in the same dark blue suit he wore to our wedding dinner rehearsal, only now there was no warmth or tenderness in his smile, only calculation and anticipation of victory. His lawyer, Trim, with a clipboard in his hands, was whispering something in his ear, and they both looked like they were preparing for a theatrical production. Thomas turned, saw me, then his mom, and, as if forgetting where he was, waved his hand with such inappropriate lightness, as if we were at a school fair, and not at a hearing where the fate of a child was being decided. Aurora didn't wave back. The courtroom looked like a stage, polished surfaces, high bench backs, the sound of footsteps bouncing off the walls. Our names were on the to-do list, and although technically it was about me, they weren't really judging me, they were judging the me he created by distorting the truth, ripping out individual moments and turning them into an accusation. When Judge Fabry entered, a tall, reserved woman with clear, attentive eyes, silence fell in the courtroom, so thick that it seemed to swallow her breath. She nodded at Thomas's lawyer, "You can start now." And he immediately, without delay, began to paint a picture of Thomas as a model of stability, reliability, decency, with a clean house, a proven career, and the right attitude towards parenthood, as opposed to me, a woman whose emotionality was presented as a threat. He read out text messages that were completely taken out of context. In one of them I wrote to Thomas that I was depressed and exhausted, and this, in his presentation, became proof that I was not able to be a mother. In another case, I simply asked him not to raise his voice in front of me, not because I wanted to command, but because I was tired of feeling as if every harsh word was crashing into the walls, into the heart, into the psyche of the child. But this was distorted in the statement as a manifestation of control and manipulation, and at the moment when the lawyer read it out, emphasizing, as if I was trying to dominate and suppress, I sat motionless, as if rooted to the chair, feeling how the past, my own past, turns into weapons, into ammunition, neatly laid out on the table, each of which is a human being, the man I once shared a bed, a house, and dreams with. Now he's using every phrase, every message, every attempt to preserve dignity in our crumbling lives against me. When asked if he personally wanted to add something, Thomas, maintaining the same calm and collected tone as he once read out the vows of love at our wedding, said, "She is unwell. She tells our daughter that I'm a bad guy. It confuses her. She makes Aurora afraid of me. I don't want to take her away out of anger. I'm doing this to protect her." The word protect hit me harder than anything else, not because it was new, but because it was mine, because I said it over and over again, telling myself that this was what I did every night, when I double-locked the door, every time I refused to take days off. Just to be with his daughter, and now this word, sacred, wounded, taken out of context, sounded like a slap in his mouth. Judge Fabry looked up from her papers and looked at me directly, her voice dry, almost emotionless. "Miss Mondi, do you have an answer?" I opened my mouth, feeling the first sound twitch in my throat, as everything inside tightened into a knot, as my heart began to beat at a pace that did not allow me to breathe, but nothing came out, only a heavy breath, only a convulsive movement of my lips, and an unbearable feeling of helplessness began to beat in my chest. My tongue felt like lead, my lips felt like ice, and all I could do was look at Aurora, who was sitting behind me, swinging her legs, which were too short to reach the floor, in her dress with sunflowers, which now seemed almost a symbol, like a banner under which a soldier fights. She looked at me with a look in which there was concern, but not fear, the look of a person who waits, but does not beg, who believes, but already knows that help may not come. My lawyer cleared his throat and made a restrained speech about how emotional overload is part of parenthood, especially alone, but his words were like a paper wall against the wind, smooth, correct, legally appropriate, but meaningless in the context of what was really happening in our lives. No one mentioned the fight when Thomas was yelling at me on the phone, and Aurora was sitting on the floor hugging her knees, trying to disappear. No one remembered how she started sleepwalking again after his weekend, did not ask why her drawings turned black and white, although she used to love to draw a rainbow. This was not in the case. It wasn't included in their version of the story. The judge only nodded slightly, making notes, and I felt the walls move closer, as space shrinks, as my breathing becomes ragged, and my hands convulsively clutched the armrests of the chair, as if I could hold myself, hold reality, hold my daughter if I just didn't let go. And then Thomas stood up again, his voice still as calm as that of an announcer reading out the weather forecast. "Your Honor, I want full custody. I believe that my daughter is being emotionally harmed, and I don't think that joint custody is in her best interests anymore." It was like a blow, measured, precise, delivered when I was already on the verge. I looked at Aurora again, not knowing how to protect her, how to explain that the love that had always seemed unshakable to her could be questioned in this room, where decisions are made not by the heart, but by papers. And it was at that moment that Aurora let go of my mother's hand, stood up, and walked forward, without asking permission, without looking back, without hesitating for a second. "Your Honor," it sounded in complete silence, and her voice was not loud, but clear, and there was more confidence in it than in all my attempts. I brought the video from Dad's phone. "I think you should see this." The air in the room froze, the sound disappeared, and everyone froze, as if time itself had stopped with an unexpected jolt. Thomas's face darkened, and as I turned in the seat, I saw his cheekbones tighten, his lips tighten into a thin white line. My mom gasped, as if she had finally exhaled what she had been holding in for the entire hour. And I just looked at Aurora, standing there, small, but at that moment majestic, with her shoulders back, with a straight back, with a tablet in her hands, as if it were not a child's device, but the key to the truth. Judge Fabry frowned. I beg your pardon? Aurora, without flinching, raised the tablet higher. This is from last weekend. He didn't know I was awake. But I woke up. I heard what he said. And I thought it might make a difference. No one said a word. Not Thomas, not his lawyer, not even the judge. And at that moment, for the first time in the entire hearing, I felt that something had really changed, not in court, but in the atmosphere, in reality, in the balance of power. Aurora brought more than a video. She brought the truth. And everyone felt it. She stood in the center of the courtroom, as if on a pedestal, her dress with sunflowers slightly lifted, the hem touched her knees, but she did not fidget, did not look around for approval. She stood alone, facing the judge, facing her fate. I brought the video from Dad's phone, she said again, a little louder, so that no one dared to ignore. Judge Fabry turned slightly to the bailiff and said, "Bring him here." Aurora took a few steps forward and handed the tablet to the bailiff, who, without looking at her, carefully carried the device to the judge. The silence in the hall stretched like a string ready to snap. Thomas clenched his teeth, and just by the way his temple twitched, it was possible to understand how much emotion he was hiding under the mask of calmness. His lawyer glanced at him, then at the tablet, then back at him, silently but eloquently. No one moved. The judge turned the screen towards her and pressed the play button, and at that moment there was such silence in the hall, as if every person in the room stopped breathing at the same time, as if the air had become dense and viscous, causing hearts to beat in their chests with painful clarity. At first, there was only darkness and barely discernible background noise on the screen, the same distant hum that penetrates the walls in the late evening when the city subsides outside the windows, and only the wind rustles through the leaves and creaks in the window frames. Then a voice, loud, angry, and harsh, not at all like the cool and balanced tone that Thomas had used in court just a minute ago. It was his real voice, without masks, without an effort to please, without an attempt to seem decent. It was the voice of a man I knew and was afraid of. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Come on, try telling someone. See what happens. Eventually, you'll end up in a foster home and realize that your precious mom won't be able to save you. She's pathetic." There was a creak of a chair, the clink of a plate, and someone's sigh. And then Aurora's quiet, frightened voice, "I'm sorry." Her voice trembled like the rustle of an autumn leaf, and was immediately rudely cut off. "Don't answer. You're lucky I let you come at all. If you say a word to her, I swear." The judge pressed pause. She didn't say a word, just stared at the screen, at the still image, as if trying to read not only the frames, but also what was behind them: fear, loneliness, threat. Thomas started fidgeting, tension showed on his face, and even his lawyer, who had been confident and collected before, suddenly panicked, leaned over to him, whispering something hurriedly, but the judge raised her hand and motioned for silence. "Where did it come from? What is it?" she asked in a flat voice. Aurora answered without hesitation. "He left his phone on the couch. I heard him screaming. I wanted to write it down. I was scared, but I thought if someone hears this, maybe they'll believe me and Mom." My chest tightened, my eyes stung, and I tried my best not to cry. Not here, not now, not when my daughter, my brave, smart, incredible daughter, had just done something most adults wouldn't have the strength to do. I wanted to run up to her, grab her in my arms, hold her close, tell her that she shouldn't have done this, that this was not her burden, not her fight, but I stayed where I was because I understood that this moment belongs to her, only her. Thomas, as if sensing that he was losing control, spoke again, and his voice was no longer confident, but strained, with a caustic note of justification. "Your Honor, this recording is completely out of context. I disciplined her. She was behaving badly." Before he could finish, the judge abruptly cut him off, not raising her voice, but with such firmness that the room seemed to shake, quite. Thomas immediately fell silent, his face lost color, and something like confusion appeared in his eyes. Judge Fabry turned to Aurora, and her voice became softer, but no less confident. "Thank you for your courage." She nodded and added, "You can go back to your place." Aurora nodded slightly, and her steps were no longer as firm as before. The weight of what had happened began to gradually fall on her shoulders, on the small shoulders of a 7-year-old girl who had just changed the course of the trial. Mom reached out to her and pulled her onto her lap, hugging her so tightly, as if she wanted to protect her from the whole world, from pain, from guilt, from all the consequences. The judge looked at me. "Miss Monty, is there anything you want to add?" This time, I didn't hesitate. I found a voice, not loud, not passionate, but firm as a stone that has passed through fire. "No, Your Honor. I think my daughter has said everything." The judge nodded, then, leaning against the back of her chair, closed her eyes for just a moment, but in that moment the gravity of the decision was read. When she opened her eyes again, they were already firm, focused, without hesitation. "In light of this evidence, I demand an immediate review of all custody agreements. Until the procedure is completed, full temporary custody is transferred to Miss Monty. Visits are supervised only for Mr. Amato." Pause. Then she added, turning to the bailiff, "Please remove Mr. Amato from the courtroom until further notice." Thomas froze, his face frozen in an expression of disbelief, as if someone had ripped the earth out from under him. "You can't be serious," he began, but the bailiff was already stepping forward. For a second, I thought Thomas was going to try to argue, but instead he just took one last look, at the judge, at me, at Aurora, and left, slowly, without turning around, and his lawyer hurriedly followed him, fumbling through papers. The courtroom slowly began to empty, as if the tension had left the walls and taken all the outsiders with it. We stayed seated. I couldn't move, as if every cell in my body still didn't believe that this had happened, that the struggle I'd been fighting for so long and alone had suddenly received an answer. Aurora was silent, her head resting on my mother's shoulder, and there was something painfully touching about it. A child who had grown up for a while, now needed someone's warmth again. Finally, I got up, went over to them and knelt down next to my daughter, hugged her and whispered, "You were so brave." She nodded without saying a word. I could see the weariness and realization reflected in her eyes, not only what she had done, but also what the path to it was. She didn't just tell the truth, she stood up against fear, against the one who taught her to be silent, and this changed everything. The moment Thomas left the courtroom under the supervision of the bailiff, the whole atmosphere changed, as if the invisible tension that enveloped each of us in this stuffy, cold space was discharged, dissipated into the air, leaving behind a silence filled not with anxiety, but with something new, almost unfamiliar, hope. It felt like someone had opened a window in the room where we had all been holding our breath for a long time, and now the air, though not quite fresh, but no longer suffocating, finally penetrated our lungs, allowing me to breathe in, not completely relaxing, no, but enough to remember that there is still a voice, that I am alive, and something has changed irreversibly. The judge, having finished her brief instructions and ordered temporary custody, briefly left the conference room, and when she returned, her face was still restrained and professional, but in her gaze, when she glanced at Aurora, I noticed something that I had not seen before. It was not pity, not surprise. It was respect, a quiet recognition of the strength coming from a girl who wasn't afraid to stand up and tell the truth when the adults were silent. I slowly began to pack our things, my fingers trembling slightly as I packed Aurora's backpack, carefully putting everything in it, as if even the trivial little things, a pencil, a rubber band, a note, required special attention after all that had happened. Aurora was still curled up in my mother's arms, her eyes were closed, but I knew she wasn't sleeping, she was just resting, letting her body and mind calm down after the stress she'd been through. The tablet, now turned off, lay next to her on the bench, its screen dark, but as if it still retained traces of what had been said. I reached out to her, touched her fingers. "Do you want to come with me?" I asked. She nodded, without opening her eyes, and slowly slid off the bench, allowing me to take her hand, so warm, so fragile, but at the same time so strong. When we left the hall, the people who remained in the corridor looked at us. Someone quickly looked away, as if they did not want to witness something that went beyond their understanding. Someone, on the contrary, stayed longer, looking not at me, but at Aurora, with surprise, respectfully, as someone who has done the impossible. One woman, as we passed by, silently whispered, "Brave." I didn't know if Aurora had heard it, but I did. Outside the courtroom doors, I knelt down to be on a level with her. My palms lay on top of her hands, and I finally looked into her eyes, not as a mother looking for an explanation, but as a person who needed to hear someone else. "Are you okay?" I asked. She shrugged her shoulders, and then, after a short pause, said, "I didn't want to do that. But I had to." I nodded, fighting back tears. "I know," I said. "I'm so proud of you. You shouldn't have carried this alone." She looked at the floor and added softly, as if to herself, "I didn't know if they would believe me." My breath caught in my throat, and my voice faltered. "They believed it. Because you told the truth. And because you were strong enough to stand up when no one else could." Aurora looked up at me, and there were silent tears in her eyes, reflecting both light and pain. "Does this mean that I won't have to go back to Dad's house?" "What is it?" she asked. I held her close, as tightly as I could, not breaking her, not suppressing her, but just trying to convey everything through touch. "You're safe. That's what's important." Later, the bailiffs gave us a number of additional instructions, including the time schedule of supervised visits for Thomas, and explained that until a final conclusion was received from a court-appointed consultant, his access to Aurora would be limited. It was not the end. There were still many hearings ahead, even more papers, even more cold halls where words are weighed not by truth, but by form. But the most difficult, the most destructive has already been left behind. On the same day, we went to my mom's. I didn't want to go home, not because I was afraid, but because the silence in our apartment could be too loud, especially now, after everything that had happened, and I didn't want Aurora to hear the echo of pain in her again. Mom made soup even though it was warm outside. She always made soup on difficult days, saying it helped her move forward when everything else seemed stationary. While I was sitting on the couch and filling out another custody document, Aurora was drawing at the kitchen table, silently, intently, as if she didn't fully understand what she was doing. After a while, she came up to me and handed me a piece of paper. There were two hands clutching his heart, childish lines, a little uneven, but touching to the point of tears. Under the drawing, in large letters, she wrote, "The truth is brave." My breath caught in my throat. Not the one that whispers out of the dark, but the one that comes out of my chest when the pain finds a way out, I said then almost in a whisper, looking at her. But Aurora didn't say anything. She just sat next to me, put her head on my arm and was silent. That evening, before going to bed, we returned to our jar of truth, which was covered with dust and stood on a shelf, as a reminder of the times when we did not yet know that the truth could be a weapon. I was holding her on my lap, sitting on the bed, and my mother was sitting across from me, tired but calm. "Do you want to be the first?" I asked Aurora. She shook her head and pointed to the top note. I took it out and unwrapped it. The handwriting was childish, uneven, and it read, "What happens when the truth hurts people?" I looked at her. "Did you write that?" She nodded, and her voice was almost inaudible. "I didn't want to hurt Dad. I just didn't want to be afraid anymore." I reached out and took her hand, trying to put into that touch everything that could not fit into words, and I said, looking her straight in the eye, so that she would remember it not as a consolation, but as the truth. "The truth can hurt, yes, sometimes strongly, deeply, unexpectedly, but silence, especially the forced, especially the one that hides fear, hurts even more because it leaves you alone with the pain, makes you a participant in a lie that you never belonged to." I squeezed her fingers a little to emphasize that what you did today didn't hurt anyone. You protected yourself. You protected us. She nodded, but quietly objected, "That's not so." She looked away for a few seconds, looked at the jar, which was still standing between us, as a symbol of the past, as a vessel storing the most difficult questions and the most honest answers, and then whispered, "I think we should keep doing that." "We'll do that," I said, feeling my throat tighten with tenderness and pain. "Every night. As long as we have questions, we will have a place where they should be." That night, when she finally fell asleep, curled up on the couch next to Pepper the penguin, as if looking for a touch of the familiar world in a new reality, I got out of bed and went into the living room, going to the window, where streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk and rare cars cut the night air, reminding that life outside our walls continued, indifferent, dispassionate, but also unshakably constant. But inside our world, everything has changed. It has changed not only because the court ruled, but because someone, whose voice had recently trembled with fear, learned to speak loudly, firmly, and clearly. Thomas no longer controlled the narrative, he no longer dictated reality, did not form images, did not turn us into heroines of his fictional script. And, for the first time since the divorce, I felt that I could really breathe deeply, without a restraining barrier in my chest, because I knew that I was no longer alone in this struggle. My daughter was with me, not just as a child who needed protection, but as a person who stood up for herself. Protection. She entered a world that was too difficult for her 7 years, and not only endured it, she changed it, turned the tide of things, turned reality around. The final custody hearing took place 4 weeks after Aurora entered the courtroom with a tablet in her hands and a voice that silenced even the most vociferous. A lot has changed during this time. The court-appointed consultant held a series of meetings with Thomas and his entourage, studied the dynamics of communication, and the result was a voluminous report that spoke not only about controlling behavior and emotional instability, but also about an alarming lack of empathy for the child's well-being, manipulation, and pressure that became apparent. Even for a professional. Of course, Thomas denied everything. He always denied, even when the truth stood in front of him, even when she spoke in his own voice, recorded, clear, indisputable. But the video turned out to be more eloquent than any of his words, a cold, unbiased testimony of what had remained hidden until that moment. When the judge read out the final decision, she did it in an even voice, without emotion, but every word was like a light in a dark room for me. I was given full physical and legal custody, with the right to make all key decisions. Thomas was given only 2 visits a month in a neutral center, under the supervision of specialists, without the right to privacy, without overnight stays, without locked doors and half-whispered threats. Aurora's voice destroyed this illusion, the illusion of an ideal father, which she had so carefully built, and did it in a way that no adult testimony could. On the day when all this was legally fixed, we left the courthouse in silence, and this silence was not heavy. There was no fear in it, there was finality in it. Aurora held my hand as we walked down the long stone steps leading to the exit, and her fingers were warm and firm, squeezing my hand not out of fear, but out of habit, out of a bond that only grew stronger after all. My mother was walking next to me, a little ahead, her purse swinging on her hip, her gaze sliding along the sidewalk, looking for Thomas, even though we all knew he wouldn't show up. Not now, not here. He hadn't spoken to me since the first hearing, and that suited me, the silence, in which there were no threats. Later that evening, we went to the diner, the one with the red booths and animal-shaped pancakes that Aurora loved so much. She sat down in front of me, picked up her chocolate milk with a straw and asked, "Is it over yet?" I didn't lie, it's safer now. We haven't finished growing yet, but we're not afraid anymore. She nodded, without taking her eyes off the mug, and slowly stirred the milk. "I'm glad I told you," she said. "Me too," I replied. There are days when I still replay that scene in my head, the courtroom, the cold light, the exhalations of people frozen in their seats, and Aurora's voice, sounding so clear, so calm, and at the same time with such force that no legal argument could match it. My daughter reminded me that strength is not a cry, not a loud protest, not suppression, but courage. The courage to speak up when you're not sure if they'll hear you. The courage to be the one who stands up, even if his knees are shaking. A few weeks after the final decision was made, I started therapy again, not because I felt like I was collapsing, not because I couldn't cope anymore, but because for the first time in a long time I had the space to really realize what I had been through and allow myself not only to survive, but also to live. Every new day, without hiding from memories, without muffling feelings in a hurry and necessity. I realized that I had spent so much time in combat mode, in constant tension, building defenses, planning every step, measuring words to avoid being distorted, that I had never learned to feel safe again, even when the threat was over. And although the road to inner peace was not going to be fast, for the first time I felt that I could walk it, because now I had time, I had the right not to be strong every minute, I had someone by my side. Aurora, who went through this journey with us, has also changed. Her drawings, which used to be filled with images of houses without windows, gray not in color, but in mood, with empty doorways and heavy clouds above them, have become different. Now she was painting trees, not just crowns and trunks, but roots stubbornly digging into the ground, as if she wanted to emphasize that she had taken root, that she had found a foothold. She drew children holding hands, the sun in the upper corner of the sheet, and, most importantly, she drew a jar of truth and attached the drawing to her bedroom wall as a reminder of her vow not to shut herself in, not to hide feelings, not to be afraid to name them. Every evening she came up to me, gently tugged on my sleeve and reminded me, "Mom, we haven't checked the jar yet," and there was something sacred in these words, as if we were returning to our ritual, not to play, not to show off, but in order not to forget who we are and what we've been through. One evening, when I opened the note, I read, "Are brave people afraid?" I smiled at Aurora and said, "Yes. They just don't let fear put an end to it. They let it be a comma, part of a sentence, but not a final." She nodded and hid her head under the blanket, as if digesting what she had heard. A few days later, another note appeared. "Can children protect adults?" I looked at her, and this time, not smiling, but with complete seriousness, I said, "You did it. You protected me in a way that I couldn't protect myself." That evening, she didn't ask any more questions. She just laid down next to me, nuzzled her nose into my shoulder, and we lay there in silence, feeling our hearts beating in the same rhythm. I am not telling this story because it has become complete. No such story ends with a court decision, a certificate, or a seal. I'm telling it because right now there are women somewhere who are sitting in silence, in front of a window or next to a baby's crib, and wondering if they have the strength to step out of this circle, to say out loud what hasn't been said for years, to believe that the truth can have weight. Even if the person opposite is charming, persuasive, and respected. I tell it because I know that sometimes the truth cannot be heard from the mouth of a lawyer, from the formal words of witnesses, from boring sheets of paper. Sometimes the truth sounds like the voice of a child who has seen too much, who has realized that silence is no longer an option. I used to believe that being a good mother meant protecting Aurora from everything that was hard, that hurt, that could leave a mark. Now I understand that being a mother means being there for me. To be around in tears. To be around in fear. Teach her to speak, even when she's scared, even when her voice is shaking. To show that you can cry and still stay strong. To teach her not to be ashamed of the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. To show that after a fall, you can get up, wipe off the dust and continue walking. We still have hard days when dreams are disturbing, when memories come back, when fatigue overwhelms us. But they don't define us. We no longer live in a world where everything is dominated by fear. We are not the frightened shadows of ourselves that Thomas wanted us to be. We speak when we want to be heard. We are silent when we feel like it. And we're free. The day Aurora stood up and said her first no, not in protest, but in truth, she saved us both. She didn't just bring a tablet. She brought light to the courtroom, not harsh, not blinding, but warm, clean, and truthful. And for the first time in many years, I felt that I was not losing her, but regaining her. I saw her not as a child who needed to be saved, but as a person capable of action, choice, and strength. And maybe that's when I saw myself the way I wanted to be all the time. If you're still here, if you've listened to the end, thank you. It wasn't easy to tell this story. Every word raised a layer of pain, but I believe that such stories need to be told, because somewhere right now another mother is holding her child's hand and thinks that no one will believe her, that her voice is too quiet. Or maybe she just needed to hear it. If this story resonated with you, please like the video and share it with those who might need it. Leave a comment, I read them all, and every word you say means more to me than you can imagine. And if you want to hear more real stories, honest, sincere, real, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It's not over yet. But it's already a start. Thank you for being here. Stay brave, stay kind, and never forget that the truth matters.